Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of APIs You Won't Hate with me, Phil Sturgeon, and no Mike, the co-host. So I'm still muddling through trying to figure out what buttons I'm meant to press, but slowly getting the hang of it. And thankfully, I'm joined today by Lorna Mitchell. Say hello.
Hi. Hello. Happy to be here.
Nice. How's it going? I think you've been on the podcast before. I meant to actually look that up back in the day, talking about something or other. But if
I
not,
actually don't think I have. I have written for APIs You Won't Hate, and I like to write. I should do that again. Not sure we've done the podcast thing before.
all right. Well, either way, welcome. And for folks who don't know who you are, could you describe a little bit about yourself?
Sure, I'm Lorna. I'm currently VP of Developer Experience at Redocly. But my background is I've been a software engineer for a long time. I'm a conference speaker, I'm a published author, and I am mad passionate about APIs and open source.
Sorry, I was just doing some research live on a podcast like a real professional. Fantastic. Yeah, no, your name pops up everywhere in OpenAPI. And yeah, you were pretty helpful in the OpenAPI 3.1 stuff when we were trying to get all of that across the line. And what was it? What was the main thing you were working on? I completely forgot. Because my whole thing was like JSON schema needs to match OpenAPI, or what are we even doing? But you were working on other bits.
Yeah, so for 3.1, which is when I really came into working on OpenAPI itself, I was working on the webhooks thing.
Mm.
And that's when I was at Vonage. And with their two-way messaging APIs, you need webhooks. Callbacks are not the same.
Yeah.
So that was, in my not humble at all opinion, one of the best things about the 3.1 release of OpenAPI.
Absolutely. I forgot that was you that helped push that through. Yeah, we're using it right now for some webhook stuff that Protect Earth's doing. So yeah, it's really nice that that's there, because it was always a bit weird trying to hack that into callbacks. You'd have to like pretend, you'd have to make some sort of fake URL called like webhooks or something, and then just kind of pretend what it was for. But no, it's useful to be able to say sometimes there are messages that are going to come from this server that aren't simply in response to a request you just made. You can register for a webhook through the website or whatever. I mean, Shopify is super weird. We're registering for webhooks with them through like a CLI command, which is awkward. But then it will just forever spit webhooks at us on topics that aren't related to a single thing. So it's really handy to have that in there.
Yeah, I think there's loads of use cases. Callbacks gave us half of it. It's in response to an incoming request, but webhooks lets you have that payload going across in response to something else.
Yeah, brilliant. And so you've been involved in loads of stuff with OpenAPI, and obviously you're working for Redocly now. But yeah, we've both been kind of in the same spaces working on trying to make like a sidekick for OpenAPI, right? I did that recent blog post about how Redocly has kind of got there now, but you were around in Specky trying to make that useful and spectral. And you just talk a little bit about those tools and where you feel like they fell short, and what they're good at, what they're bad at, and then what's going on with Redocly and its kind of OpenAPI sidekick now.
Yeah, no, I think there are so many great API tools now, but it's not as if they just came out of thin air now. Like, they're ready to use now. Like you say, Specky, I think, was one of the first ones that at least I knew of, which really helped me to validate and check things. I'm not sure I was customizing it a lot, and so that can be quite frustrating if you're using out-of-the-box rules. I think too many people do that, and then it can be a hard experience.
Yeah, I think specifically, I think you were the person who, a lot of people really hated all of the default rules about like tags and stuff. But I seem to remember you giving a bunch of feedback about that. Like, why is it constantly complaining that I need to use tags? I don't actually need to use tags. And that was just in there for some reason.
I think it was an API with like 2 endpoints, so I really don't need to tag them, but thanks. And then we used Spectral a lot. I realized you'll love this. I realized the other day that my personal blog, so that's lornajane.net, we'll put it in the show notes. My personal blog has instructions of how to lint APIs with Spectral, but it does not have how to lint them with Redocly CLI, that's what I do now.
Time for an updated blog post, I think.
Definitely. Well, and we'll just write all the blog posts for all the
Yeah.
tools, because I think they're all great. But yeah, I used Spectral, and that's when I started customizing rules. I was working for Vonage, and what's interesting about this is I think I did Specky when I was working for doing like integration consultancy. I worked on Spectral when I was at Vonage. They're an API provider, but they have a lot of APIs, and they're quite different from each other. So working on Spectral there and making sure that we're enforcing that consistency. And, I'm not sure developer experience was a buzzword then, but that's how I would call it now. In between, I worked at another cool cloud SaaS, and they had an API, and that's when I started using Redocly's tools, because I really enjoyed their linting and, of course, Redoc, API reference documentation. So now I'm at Redocly working on Redocly CLI, which, as you say, is the API sidekick. And I think I'm still seeing some of those same problems, like people use the recommended rule set and then tell us it's wrong.
Yeah,
You need to
yeah,
like
yeah.
101, run it, will give you some good feedback. And I'm seeing some more of those, upload your API and we'll tell you what you've done wrong. Like, yeah, but every API is different, so you need to customize your rule set and use it yourself. So Redocly CLI is open source. It does do the linting, but it does a couple of things that I would describe as either side of that in the process. One is it has functionality for splitting your OpenAPI up into multiple files, so you don't have to deal with 100,000 lines of diff. And also you can look at which segments changed, and that can be easier for review.
Mm.
It's also easier on your editor. And then you can
Well, yeah, whenever you're trying to like send a pull request on a file that's 10,000 lines long, firstly, it's just not going to show you the preview half the time. And secondly, it's more likely to conflict because two people worked on something completely different, but it didn't realize it was completely different and therefore barf.
Yeah,
So
and it's hard
yeah.
to reason about which sections should have changed when it's
Mm.
just one long thing.
I think before we go past it too quickly, I think one of the most impressive things. So when I was doing the review of Redocly, I was like, okay, yeah, I know what this is about. They got like a linty thing, and they got like a bundly thing, and they got like a preview your docs. These are all good. These aren't new things. They've been kind of brought together in one new tool that does a whole bunch of things, which is great. But what I was really excited about discovering was the split thing, because the number of times like I'm looking at some massive open API file going, like it's been generated from HTTP or whatever. You're kind of like you're just staring at that massive file going, this is going to take some time. And I think like Stoplight Studio at some point had baked some functionality in, like move this to a model, but then the button broke and it was disabled. And I begged and begged and begged to get that button put back in, and they went, "Oh, we're too busy." I was like, "No," because taking a giant open API file, like I feel like no one's doing enough refactoring, automating refactoring, like move this to model, and these two in place things look the same. Change that to one ref, and I think Split does a lot of that. They notice that you've got refs, and they'll like bung them off into files. And it did also notice that two things were the same thing and put them into the same file. And I was like, God damn, that's useful. So I
Yeah,
was really glad to see that, even though it's like a undersung kind of feature.
it is, but I think it does really help. And particularly as we mature in our API practice, it's not just about I wrote an API file or I generated one. There you go. I've done that. Tick. Those are living, changing documents. And so the maintenance aspect gets quite big. So yeah, I think the splitting, bundling, and we also have join. So where people are maintaining every team
Ooh, I missed that.
maintains an API each, but you publish it as a single surface. That's actually
Mm.
really messy. I've seen some horrible merge attempts and join
Yeah.
attempts to handle that, which I think is really nice. So from an API management point of view. The other thing that I love about Redocly CLI, which I am now seeing in other places, but Redocly CLI's had it for a long time, is decorators. The ability to
Mm.
repeatably transform something in an OpenAPI document. So you get something, it's not perfect, or you want to add something for the next stage in your pipeline. There's a decorators set. There are some built-in decorators, but you can also extend it by saying, whenever you see an operation parameter, do this.
Interesting. Like what? Make it more tangible for my struggling brain.
So we do things like you can replace all the descriptions. This operation ID should have this description. This one should have this description. So if you're
Mm.
getting poor quality generated content, or you want to add, the descriptions in OpenAPI support Markdown. So you can add really beautiful, rich links and whatever. Do
Mm.
you want to maintain that in your source code when you're generating from that?
Oh, I see.
It's
Yeah.
like you're maintaining the YAML for the markdown in your source code. I do understand why people don't enjoy that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's the people that advocate most for the kind of code first, bung it all into annotations in our code approach are the people who aren't ever going to put very much effort into their documentation, and therefore, you're not going to see these like 100 lines of markdown showing up in the source code purely because they wouldn't bother to write it, and the tech writers can't be faffed to go and like get in there.
Or may not
So
even have access.
right,
That's
yeah,
really common. You get frustrated tech writers who could add really great, descriptive content, example values. If it's generated from source code and they're not giving access to the source code, it's very difficult
yeah,
to include that. And we're starting to see tools as well. Obviously, the documentation tools, Redoc and Friends, other very good API documentation tools are available. Uh,
standard
and
BBC
yes,
response. Yeah,
well, I just feel like I don't mind which one you use, but please give me some documentation,
yeah, yeah.
And the SDK generators as well. We've just seen Speakeasy release the overlays tool because their tool does better with some added metadata. And you don't want to
Mm,
maintain that in wherever upstream your OpenAPI things are coming from.
great. Well, that brings us on nicely. So I've been meaning to pick your brain about overlays a bit because it's something that there's increasing interest in. I mean, I work with the folks at Bump as well, and they were asking about a bit more about overlays. And there's a lot of people in the docs space who are interested in that idea for exactly what you're saying. Like if, the code first people, they dump out some open API and it's whatever it is. And if you edit it, then it's just, gone the next time they dump it out.
Mm-hmm.
Or you've got the people that are design first where the YAML is the source of truth and they do all their edits and that's that. And that's probably a little bit easier to add things into. But then maybe you're trying to expand somebody else's published design first stuff that you don't have any control over. So there's this kind of constant idea of taking some open API and then like programmatically adding stuff to it for whatever reason. Tech writing, you do translation, you add a bunch of stuff in. I've seen your name come up for quite a few blog posts and overlays. And while I was doing some research, I noticed the folks over at Redoc aren't quite so impressed with it. So I was wondering if you could explain where it all sits.
Controversial. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so. There's an older blog post on the Redoc website where Adam, didn't love it when he saw it. It's not a brand fresh site, but it is the top hit for overlays, so it's not a
Yeah.
secret. And I think the point there is a good one, that it's yet another complex structure. We've got a specification with no tooling at all, and it
Mm,
requires use of JSON path. Now, if you've been using Spectral, that is very JSON path heavy,
yeah.
but Redocly CLI isn't. We do that by considering the OpenAPI as like a tree structure and the different data types.
Mm,
So everything's very type aware. And you can filter on fields and it knows, oh, this is a parameter. It'll have an in. Then with JSON path, it's just blind data structure. So we
yeah.
don't have JSON path currently in the Redocly CLI ecosystem. I don't think at all. And so that extra learning curve, you sort of think, well, I don't know who could use this. Like, it's a good solution, but there's no validator for the format. And the learning curve puts it beyond a lot of the users that at
Mm.
Redocly we're trying to enable.
Right. And so I think when we're talking about the use cases for decorators, like overlays kind of intended to be a more generic implementation of that
Yes.
anyone could theoretically use, whereas decorators is more of a like Redocly feature and could theoretically be, rejimmied to be the same thing. But what you're saying is, yeah, the right now overlays are designed to use JSON path. And for anyone who's not familiar, if you've been using Spectral, then yeah, that's the absolutely batshit bunch of things you're typing into those rules to try and make anything make work. Make work. You can tell I'm tired. I was saying before the show, I've just come back from API days, and normally API days gets you a hangover, but this time I've just been like sick for a couple of days, and now I've just not slept. I decided to go and get myself into a hotel room early, and then like got into bed at 8 o'clock, and there were just like homeless people screaming outside my window until 4 a.m. And then the fire alarm went off at 8 a.m. and I'm like, what is reality? So yeah, JSON path is even more confusing than my brain right now. And basically you have to kind of tell it what you would like to filter through, kind of like a CSS selector, but for JSON. And then, so JSON path doesn't have a standard. They're kind of working on one, but it's not there yet. And so much like what Markdown had, like Markdown Plus and a million different Markdown flavors, JSON path now has JSON path Plus, which Stoplight was using for quite a long time and used as the main thing for spectral rules. But then that wasn't quite enough. And then like Nimmer appeared, which is JSON path plus with some other bits. And like even JSON path plus not Nimmer is a mixture of a lot of just squiggles and doodles and backticks. But also you can bung regex in there. So you can kind of say, I would like to, dot gets you into the property of something. And then square brackets can get you into like the array of something. And then there's like stars to say all of them. And there's tildes to say parent. And you can kind of fetch all of the headers where the parent is on this and the name begins with an X. And you can do really powerful things, but it's almost impossible in any sort of I've made lots of spectral rule sets because I built an NPM rule set and I built an NPM test suite using Jest so that I can type in these crazy things and go, am I close yet? Am I close yet? Am I close yet? And the result will show me what I've done. But most people are just writing a YAML file and that doesn't work. So you have to like literally switch over to your terminal, run it, and it just blows up at you in strange ways. And it can be very hard to do. So it's one of the things I really appreciated about Redocly CLI was the switch to using just named selectors. So you could say like header instead of going like, for, and I think Spectral's trying, it made early attempts to fix that by adding aliases, but I'm just going off on a bit of a tirade now. I got to get some stuff off my chest.
Carry on.
The roadmap for aliases was powerful and impressive, and I've spoke to Smart Bear, who have now inherited this, to try and get this back on the table. But basically, aliases, the idea was, let's come up with a list of aliases, common OpenAPI aliases, common async API aliases, and then people can use those instead. So instead of $, which is root, and then paths, brackets, /post, you would just say paths, and then you could do the square bracket /post to pull out all the post ones. So you would cut out a lot of the nonsense by using aliases to replace a certain chunk of the JSON path. Whereas I think Redocly would have said, paths, and then you would have if header, if post or something, right? So yours is more of a DSL approach, but aliases seem like a good step forward. And yeah, the aliases ended up getting defined in the core rule set of the core OpenAPI rule set, and they weren't extendable. So if you extend the core OpenAPI rule set, you can't get those aliases out. They're only available inside the place they're defined. So that meant you couldn't actually use those to help, like no one writing their own rule sets, extending OpenAPI, or no one writing their own rule sets at all could use as aliases unless you copy and paste them. And so I've been suggesting that like not only should they be extendable, but they should be defined in like the format. So you should, anyone using the OpenAPI format at all, whether it's the core rule set or not, you should get those aliases. But that's a bit more of a roadmap. One day they might fix it kind of thing. But I completely recognize the need to not JSON path and therefore avoid that entirely in overlays, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't think it is avoidable in overlays. And I feel a little bit like I've done it an injustice there, like leading with that negative, the controversial blog post, not everyone's a fan. I really think that overlays solves a real problem. Like I see this all the time. We just talked about when it's generated from code and it hasn't got enough anything. I'm also seeing much more complex pipelines now. People have multiple teams maintaining different bits of the API surface. They all ship an open API. We join it into one, and then the downstream outputs, whether that's documentation, SDK generation, API gateways, like whatever, all of them need their own enrichment. And overlays solves that problem where you don't have to, you can just, add a translation, add an example, add the hint for the correct data type for the target language in the SDK. And the team that deals with the SDKs can do that. We don't have to go all the way back. In a big organization, that's hard to find the team that maintains the thing that lives in the house that Jack built, right? So we can do that here. Overlays solves that problem. I don't think it's a coincidence that one of the implementations, so there are not many overlays implementations. One of them is mine. We can link to it. It's very hobby.
Brilliant. Yeah.
This is how I get things out of my brain. I had to write code that did it so that I could look at it.
Right.
I need to do
That's really
more
helpful.
with that.
I remember reading the official page of the overlays working group, and just a quick thing on working group. So
Mm.
OpenAPI used to do everything by everyone getting on a weekly call and then getting homework assigned, and then like maybe it was done by the next weekly call. But that was how everything ever happened. And if there wasn't enough interest in certain things, then they just wouldn't happen. But now things have been split up into working groups, and I think one of them was like workflows that I was briefly involved with. It's quite exciting, and there's a bunch of other ones, and SLAs, and yeah, so overlays was one of them, and it's great to see an early kind of finish. I don't know what phases and stages there are, but I read the repo and it said like we're basically stable now, but no one's really implemented this. So we need some big implementations to go and do it. And it's cool to hear there's some hobbyist ones or some implementations out there, but
Mhm.
that's the hard part. We had this problem at Stoplight. Everyone has this problem where you want to support a feature, but 'cause you get a few user requests come in saying like, "Could you use this feature? Can we have this feature?" And then you're like, "Oh, I'm not sure we should implement it because it's not stable yet." And the people who have like come up with it have said, "Well, we'll only call it version 1 when it's had some implementation and some feedback." So you get in this chicken and egg problem of everyone hoping somebody else will
Yeah.
implement it so that then it stabilizes. But then if they're the first to market, then you lose out, but you're not prepared to commit the resources to it.
Well,
So
no,
where
good
are we at?
news. Good news. I have a hobbyist thing, and I think Mike Ralphson has something as well. He donated me a bunch
Uh,
since mine's open
of
source.
course, Mike
He's a great
does.
person. Yeah, of course he
Brilliant.
does. It's like he's got his finger on the pulse. But there's another implementation which is from Speakeasy. Now they do cool modern SDKs. It is not a coincidence that it is them that have gone to implement with overlays because OpenAPI does not have all of the metadata that you need to generate a great SDK in every tech stack. Some of them need more data type instructions or serialization information, or, there's a lot that you need to add that wouldn't be in a standard OpenAPI description. So they have these extra extensions, the X dash fields that they add. And rather than everyone, like you say, you can't add them because then when you update your OpenAPI, they are lost. So not a
Mm,
coincidence that they implemented overlays. Their tool is available. It's open source. It includes a validator. They kind of embraced and extended the implementation a little bit, but I think that's an interesting use case too. So yeah, more than one tool to look at, and I'm
cool.
excited because I think it really solves a real problem.
That is really cool. And once again, I'm Googling mid podcast because I am extremely professional, but I'm looking at the speakeasy.dev. I'm just seeing AI powered end to end API maintenance. And again, there's like, I've just come from API days. Every other talk was about AI. And I just, my eyes are in pain from rolling. But this looks like a really useful implementation. They've noticed that they've noticed that you've typed in a duplicate schema and then just
Yeah.
like changed it to a ref, which is amazing. And there's a lot of other pretty cool looking stuff on this marketing page. Let's be clear. I like their intentions.
Yeah.
This is
And I
interesting. I need
think
to dig in more.
I'm with you in team rolling your eyes when it comes to AI is going to do everything, but
Mm,
actually the Open API, that standard machine readable specification is going to enable a bunch of AI applications. So, and also ChatGPT 4 knows quite a lot of Open API and can like
yeah,
quickly give you back some hilarious and sensible example fields, for example. I wouldn't let it write my
brilliant.
API, but when I'm working on examples, it's like, "Ugh, this could be better. Like make me
Yeah,
make me something fun with circus animals." It can do that.
brilliant. Okay, yeah, because writing, arbitrary examples was always the hardest part. I would always really struggle to do tutorials or demos because I was like, just coming up with contrived examples is so frustrating, and like everyone's got a bloody to do app and no one cares. And just I fundamentally refuse to use the pet store for anything ever. So
Oh,
yeah,
so
I
maybe
have
we can share a link to Redocly just published a museum API for more or less these reasons. Also,
nice.
the pet
Okay.
store's really outdated. SmartRev
Yeah.
only just gone to 3.1. So we've been using a variation of this museum thing internally, and we were like, we should ship this. So
Right.
I'll
Well,
link it.
so I mean, the what really annoys me about the pet store is that it's a bad API, like it's describing a bad API. It's got like a bunch of really bad conventions in the actual API that it's describing.
Mhm.
It uses a weird amount of, it uses like an odd amount of OpenAPI to do it. I think it's been copied from like Swagger 2 and not
Yes, it
been
was.
fleshed out. And then, so now the pet store lives in OpenAPI 3 when like 3.1 came out 2020, 2021.
January 2021 by the time we pressed the button. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's, it's nearly, yeah, it's a while.
Mm.
So don't use the pet store. There's other better examples. And I like that AI can help with that for sure. I mean, I have been using Copilot built into VS Code, and it's been helping me out for the Protect Earth API quite a lot. Like I was just adding an array of species to sites so that we can, ahead of time, we can say, look, these are the only species we're going to plant at this site. So when I'm going through the field and it's raining and I've got to take a photograph of 4,000 bloody trees we just planted for proof for our funding partners, I don't want to be scrolling past like sea buckthorn, which we've never planted,
Yeah.
just to get to like the subset of the 8 species that are actually in that bloody field, right?
Yeah.
Because we've got like 50 different species we may plant there. So yeah, like I was just putting that in, and I just typed on the sites list, I typed in species, and it was like, oh, would you like to add all of these obvious properties and this whole schema and then reference the docs/schema? Schemas/species that I see over there. I was like, yes, I bloody would. And it just built like loads of stuff for me. And even building that one schema was great. But there have been lots of times where it's just completely hallucinated and done something absolutely bonkers. And I just like
Yeah.
pushed it. So I
Yeah.
still don't
No,
trust it to do anything much apart from like kind of assist me. But I will never do dictated but not read with AI.
yeah, no.
It's not
And
there
I
yet.
think as well, like it's a time enhancer for me. One of the things that I find time consuming is I'm no longer particularly technically specialist in any given programming language. I write about
Mm,
4 with equal levels of danger. PHP is my original community, but it's moved on. I wouldn't
yeah,
recognize
yeah,
it if I walked past it in the street.
right.
And so and so actually I can write all of those languages and I can debug all of those languages, but I just like throw the thing I want in and I get something back and then that's enough. So otherwise you're like, how do I iterate? How do I concatenate? What have I done wrong with the scope
Yeah, yeah.
on this? Like I know that JavaScript array is a reference, but I need it to not be. And so that kind of speed up is quicker. For the things that I don't know, it just lies and I can't catch it. So yeah, I'm with you. That scares me.
That is absolutely the problem, and it's totally fine if this podcast decays into complaining about AI, because I've been meaning to talk more about AI on it for a while. We've got someone coming on soon to talk about things that it is useful for, and so we can get some of the bullshit out of the way.
Mhm.
But yeah, even with PHP, like people have said, oh, it can help you write your tests or whatever. And I was writing a test for a model, and it just kept recommending that I like write these really complicated tests for relationships, which you don't really need to do, because if you have an ORM that has relationship logic and you just say, orders should have organization, you don't really need to write a test that says that orders do have organization. But the test it wrote was invalid and didn't fundamentally work at all, and kept doing loads of other stuff. It was trying to test methods that didn't exist. Like
Yeah.
it was trying to find out if that order was allocated to something, but orders aren't allocated, like units are allocated to orders. So it saw enough to have a real college try, but it didn't actually do the right thing. And it just confused me more than if it didn't. Because if I hadn't spent like 10 minutes trying to faff around with the bad test that it made, I would have just Googled how do I test this thing
Yeah.
and then done it. So
Yeah. And I do worry about how much it helps us to learn new things. And especially if you're earlier in your career, like,
mm,
actually, is this helping you to be the best
right.
that you can be? I'm just not sure. And time will tell, I think.
Yeah. One devil's advocate there is that it's just sped up Stack Overflow copy pasting, which is, and it has a bit of knowledge of your system, whereas Stack
Hmm.
Overflow has none. So there's plenty of times that I've like Googled for a problem and like copied and pasted the close enough thing into my code base and then hope for the best. And so if it's doing that but slightly better, then okay. But
It isn't
it's still not
always.
really adding that knowledge, and you're missing the ability to see downvotes and um I mean, I think you were around in the Coding Night days, right? And
Yeah.
if not early PHP days, where a lot of people were doing really dumb stuff, and really dumb stuff was popular. And
Mm.
and the popularity of something, the frequency of which you see something, doesn't make it better. And so you kind of have to hope that at least with Stack Overflow and some of those forums, you'd have someone posting a really terrible idea that may even be accepted, and then a bunch of people downvoting and going, "What are you doing?" underneath it, which is good. And with this, it just goes, "Nah, take that, mate. It'll be fine."
Accepted answer. Go for it. Yeah. And what you want is you want the most voted answer, and you also want, did this change recently? Stack Overflow is not a new site. Some of that stuff is
It was
10
the
years
correct answer for
old.
years.
This was
And then it
correct,
changed.
but after 2015, you should do it this way. Like
Right.
that's a real answer, and I feel that the machines aren't necessarily on our side with that because they can't take in that context.
Can I do a complaint about? Oh, it's my podcast. I'll do what I want.
Yeah, I love
So
it.
one
I
of the
love your
talks,
rants. Please continue.
one of the talks I saw by a lovely bloke, well-intentioned talk, but the whole thing fundamentally seemed to be integrating with other people's APIs is really hard. So here we can get AI to do it for us. So here is an AI doing all of this really complicated, amazing stuff. And it was truly impressive what the toy demos were doing. But towards the end of the question and answer, it was very much, how much does the AI need the API to be built in a specific way? And he was like, "Oh yeah, basically there are certain ways that AI will expect the API to be built, and if it's not built following those very specific assumptions, then this basically won't work at all. So what some people do is build a new API specifically for the AI, where it does follow all of those conventions, and then it can save you loads of time." I was like, "Oh, okay, we're all just completely rebuilding all of our APIs and doing BFFs for every client just so the AI can then save some time instead of looking at the docs we spent ages making." That's that sort of thing is where my bullshit flag goes up, because it's like, is this just early days and the AI will eventually be able to talk to any API? Or are we just kind of saying like the wizard will fix it and passing more work onto API teams who probably would have had a better time sitting down with their stakeholders and asking what they really need, instead of building some shit that was so confusing in the first place that everyone's scared of looking at the documentation, and then asks for an AI to be built so they can figure out what the hell you did. Like,
And then we just
maybe
have
we
to
could just make
believe
better
it.
APIs.
Yeah. Well, and I'm an optimist, so I want to flip that argument and say you're right, but what you're actually saying is that the people who have well-designed, well-documented APIs described with OpenAPI can integrate easily and well, both with other platforms and with AI, if that's what people want to use it with. It's good for all integrations. People who have badly designed APIs, incomplete API documentation, they are going to have a hard time. I don't think the wrapper APIs add anything. You'd be better just to start again, talk to the actual user, and talk to the AI if you like. They're very chatty, and make things better.
That's cool. Yeah, I think it's a good point, is that some of those people were coming from a place of, you don't have any OpenAPI or anything similar. So if it's just like you have an implementation and then like some JSON happens, I guess, then how would anyone know anything about this? And I think OpenAPI is an interesting way that it can add in more. You can train an API on that a bit, and even if they don't understand what all of the objects are moving through, like part of something that the API community needs to do anyway, and part of my like 10-year plan, 20-year plan for like what I'm going to be blathering about in API world has always been, step one, get people defining what the hell this data is, right? Like OpenAPI isn't the end goal that we do this and then everything's brilliant, even though I talk about it plenty. It was, you have random JSON flying about the internet and no one knows what the fuck is going on. This is not great. So getting people to like write that down, make a contract, that was step one. And then, okay, great, we know what your your version of a tree and your version of a person and your version of a whatever account. But then like, can we try and have shared collections? And at Stoplight, we were doing design libraries where you can have like a repository of open API models you can reuse within your organization, because there was one company that had 500 different versions of a flight, which is literally plane goes from there to there. Like, that's not very complicated, with some seats, but there are a lot of different versions. And so they've kind of squished that down to one version of a flight now. So it's literally describe the mess and then like reduce the mess, and then like reuse those outside of the organization with shared data models and concepts like schema.org, but maybe not that, because it's like a lot of that is biological medical data, which doesn't seem very helpful, but that kind of concept. And then after that, like everyone is more trained. Hateos becomes more useful in that world because you
Yes.
don't need to train it to know exactly what that URL is. You train it to know what these generic models are and how you work with them. But it also makes AI more useful because it then has that same shared knowledge of what's coming back. So I like that approach seems to be the same as my existing approach. I don't have to change my thoughts too much. Great. But yeah, there is a lot of like magical wizard stuff in the world of AIs. And I do want to kind of get people to be a bit cautious about what they go all in on because
Yeah.
some of it doesn't seem very helpful.
Agreed.
Last bit we were going to talk about was OpenAPI 4. I have been very out of the loop on this. It has a fun name, Moonwalk. What's going on? Help.
Yeah, I'm not sure why it needed a project code name, but I think we've been kicking this around for a while. I mean, I went off and spent 2 years working in the database space and came back, we were still talking about it. So it's not going anywhere.
I was going to say you vanished for a while and then came back to
I did. I
OpenAPI land.
had
I was
an
like, yay!
absolutely lovely time doing loads of DevRel with loads of open source databases at Ivan, which was great.
Mhm.
Now I'm back in the API space. That's great as well. Didn't mention I'm an optimist. So news from the OpenAPI community then. I mean, I think there's news in both the V3 and the V4 worlds. The V3 news is just we are seeing a lot of adoption. We are seeing people using 3.1. I think some of those educational resources are starting to get out there. Companies like Redocly, but it takes the whole ecosystem.
Yeah.
And I think, even though we're commercial competitors, we know we share a community and we collaborate really well. I'm sure that's true in other industries as well. But so yeah, 3 going from strength to strength, new tools all the time, and general goodness. 4, we've just put out a blog post from the OpenAPI initiative committing to launching a version of 4 in 2024.
Okay,
So
getting
the
people
clock
ready for it instead
is
of panic.
ticking. Yep.
Yeah.
And there is, if anyone wants to see, we'll put it in the show notes. There's a repository full of discussions on GitHub about what we want to solve at a high level. We are
Mm,
looking at simplifying the structure, making it a bit more resource oriented and a
great,
little bit more
great.
approachable as well. JSON
Just
schema.
to explain on that a
Yep.
second, the resource orientated meaning it's a bit less about like paths. What are your paths? Because that's been a concern about it not really being very resty. Because
Yeah.
like paths, some people will say that in a REST API, like paths are the least important thing. And they could literally be like a random MD5 checksum is the most extreme example I've heard someone say, because it really is just, it's about interacting with resources as like a state machine.
Yeah.
And the homepage is a resource that then like lets you see other resources you could interact with in various ways and describes how. And so the fact that OpenAPI has always been like, tell me your paths, resources are optional, has always felt a little bit RPC-ish to many people. So
It
is that something
has.
that's
So,
changing?
well, and the goal, I think, with Moonwalk is to get away from paths so that we can include more types of API, including the ones that are
Mm,
less RESTful. So, with
right.
RPC, where you have one endpoint and maybe different query parameters or
Mm,
body data makes different actions happen, you can't represent that right now in
gotcha.
OpenAPI. If you can just have it's like the path and verb combination. Is it get or is it post? What's the exact
Mm,
path? Not including query parameters. That's your unique identifier. So
yeah,
we've
someone had
called,
to make OpenRPC, which is like a copy paste of OpenAPI, but tweaked it so that you could do RPC stuff. And so,
mm,
yeah, that would be nice if they
yeah,
didn't have
and
to.
looking more at there are more things than that go into what we're now calling a signature. Like, what endpoint is this? How would you route it in your code? You know, does your API do different things on header or on some
Mm,
other thing that we could take into account? Otherwise, you end up with this very lots of polymorphism because you can't correctly represent that these two things look completely different. If it's, completed orders or incomplete orders, it
yeah.
might be a filter on an endpoint, but you're going to get different types of object back. Moonwalk is going to cater for that as well. But there's a
Okay.
thriving community, lots of chat. Three isn't going anywhere. That's a lively community too. And as with the Open API initiative, we're looking more at how we can better respond to questions in that community, stuff like that. I have triage on those repos and just trying to get everyone to be a bit more present.
Nice. I will have to dive in a little bit more. I mean, bloody hell, we had Daryl Miller on the episode, on the podcast, and I didn't ask him a single question about it, but we're talking about other stuff. I think the reason they came up with Moonwalk was that they wanted a bit of a experimental playground where they could just try and hash out some ideas without everyone going, that's definitely what's happening, panic, don't do 4, which would definitely happen. We've had that before. So I can understand that. And it sounds like it's kind of got enough agreement amongst the people that were paying attention that it is moving towards possibly actually being 4. So that's what you want. So we'll just have a normal name. It will just be called OpenAPI 4.
Yeah.
We're not doing like cool branding now.
Well, and
But
Moonwalk's
that's
difficult because you're actually walking backwards. I don't know.
Yeah, this is several very casual steps backwards. Brilliant. Well, yeah, great. I'm glad to hear those changes. I mean, one small thing in my head is that there are certain things that OpenAPI won't let you do that I've always been quite happy about in a way.
Yeah.
Because like OpenAPI will let you perfectly describe a bad API, but there are some of the things you shouldn't be doing that you can currently describe. And so by being able to describe more of those things you shouldn't be doing, I'm a little bit like, flexibility is important so that you can get all the old APIs on and then you can edge them in the right direction with, automated linters and get them doing the right conventions that way. But part of it was also, man, why did you do that? Please don't do that. Change that quickly.
Yeah, I think that's
it's
a
difficult.
real concern. And, I want to represent and respect everyone else's work, but looking at the adoption for 3.1, which was a very obvious improvement and upgrade for 3.0 users, some tools were available quite quickly. I know some took some time. There's a
Yeah.
whole raft of new tools have come out for 3.1. We're really seeing the adoption now. 4.0 doesn't offer anything to existing users. It brings more people into the fold. And if you're an existing tools vendor, which obviously that's my job now, I'm not sure where we're going with that. It's going to be significantly more difficult to build for as things look at this very early stage. So I am supporting everything that's happening in the OpenAPI initiative. I'm very excited to see just better education, better appreciation in the industry for what we do with OpenAPI 3 and 3.1 and how it can help.
Yeah.
I'm watching what's happening in 4. It takes a long time to write these specifications and for tools to follow, so nobody needs to panic.
Yeah, it's not appearing anytime now. I mean, even if didn't you say that version 4 is committed to appearing sometime in 2024?
Yeah.
Well, that's 12 months long, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
and I don't know, OpenAPI initiative does not build tools, and it's not clear to me right now who will.
Right. Well, that's the thing. So yeah, like in a year's time, we could have a spec out and then still no one will use it because it takes a long time for tool and vendors to catch up. Which is why it's important to plow on whilst. But some tools have only just upgraded to 3.1. Yeah, this all takes a long time. So someone needs to be thinking about the future instead of just going, don't change anything. It's scary.
Yeah, I mean, it is about doing good support for 3.1. Lots of people are coming into APIs or raising their API game now with what's available today. And I think, I work in developer experience. I really care about stuff that you can do today. And so that's my focus.
Absolutely. Yeah, got to do both. But as long as the new one thinks about migration path, as long as it's made in such a way where there is a migration path and that can be automated, I think that's pretty important.
Yes,
but
that is one of the requirements. Yes.
Yeah, okay,
they've
good.
got it. They must have listened to you in a past life. They got it.
Yeah, well, Mike Ralphon's there saying he made Swagger to OpenAPI and he's going to make OpenAPI 3 to Moonwalk or whatever. He's on it. But that is important. And then the other thing, Eric Wild made this really good point at API Days Paris about how async API released a async parser, and it is the de facto parser. You can parse a document any way you like, but you can also use theirs, and I'm sure it's just written in TypeScript and nothing else. But this thing exists, and the majority of tools can use it. And an OpenAPI, majority of the tools are TypeScript or Node something. So I'm really thinking that that is the next most important step, is for somebody, probably Mike, let's be honest, he loves to write some code. Somebody to just volunteered him either way. Somebody to write an OpenAPI parser that is the default. Because there's been lots of these other little ones here and there. I've just deprecated one of them that I awkwardly inherited from some guy I tried to help, and then I got stuck doing all the code, and I was like, I don't have time for this. There's a lot of these awkward ones floating about, but if there can be one sample implementation, initially written by a person, but as more people use it, more people will help maintain it. And then that can be, okay, you've got your parser that works for 3.1, but there's this other parser over here that works for 4, and that makes it a lot easier to switch to because you don't have to rebuild your parser to support 4. You just use the thing, and then you don't have to worry about all the intricacy, awkward bits of YAML. It's just you have some models to work with. I really hope they can do that, and I'll be nagging people to give that a try without volunteering myself because I'm crap at code these days.
I think it's a tricky one, because I work for a tools vendor now. So I was like, oh, you're going to build some of the tools. Do you want to tell me what else you're going to build so that we don't invest our commercial expertise in that?
Yeah.
And I'm not really sure if the proliferation of many tools in OpenAPI is a feature or a bug, but I think feature. I think the competition has helped because it's very open source, isn't it? It's an open standard. There's loads of different tools. OpenAPI.tools tells that story loud and clear. You can choose. It's in your tech stack. There's always something. Whereas I think if we go to one official version, we're tied down to the speed that the central initiative works at, which isn't always the same speed the industry does.
Yeah, I mean, hey, maybe that could be a working group, right? Instead of it just being a very overworked Mike Rouse and trying to do the thing to make all the vendors happy who are all getting paid to work on their tools and he's not. Maybe that could be a working group where we're like, let's hash out like what we need from a shared parser. And then if anyone in the group ends up not really getting something that they're happy with, then they can just go and make their own however they want. But yeah, definitely, it is a difficult line in general with like, should the OpenAPI Foundation be making all this stuff? Because they're like, well, we've just made a documentation tool.
Yeah.
Like that would be pretty messed up.
Well, and the members are documentation tool vendors.
Yeah.
So that's awkward. Async API, I have the opposite one, and you might have seen this as well from having async API support at Spectral. Redocly CLI has async API support as well, just for linting. We don't have it in docs yet. And honestly, the async API community doesn't really talk about anyone else's tools. It doesn't have the same ecosystem. They just build their own tools. They're all quite closely coupled. It's the same people.
Right.
Postman pays them. That's what you get. And so it's very, very different, despite the fact that those two projects have quite a lot of shared philosophy. They also don't. And the tools is a really big differentiator.
That is interesting. Well, still, I'm always excited about the potential for collaboration. And at some point, I'll be picking your brains about, I chatted to all the other API linters and we're all going to have a conversation about like coming up with a shared rule set format. And even if it's not one that anyone particularly wants to make their default, it's just like, can we make some tools that swap them in all directions? Because that would be cool. Although I got to talk to the Optic team about, they've just come up with lint GPT, where you just write your rules as an array of strings and hope that the wizard is consistent. But I'm going to give that tool a try soon.
I think Optic currently have the best converters, so they understand this problem space. But because Redocly CLI, all our linting is very like AST data structure driven. It's not JSON path driven like the others. I had a quick look and I was like, oh, this is going to be really difficult interop because we're not describing, we're like, you have a response example here. This is what we do with response examples. It's not like it's this path, this path, this path.
Right.
Turn left at this array, then take the third success response element. Like it's not.
Yeah,
like
I got you. Because it's based on OASKit, right? And I remember how that works. Like OASKit just walks through and then goes, "Oh, I found one of these. Anyone care about this? Yeah, you do. Cool. Run some rules on it." Whereas we're like go through the rules and then like delve into the depths following this arcane direction.
Yeah.
I shouldn't have opened up this can of worms so late in the podcast. We like to stick to 30, 35 minutes normally. And I could talk to you for hours, honestly. Yeah, it's really great to have you on the show. And we'll have to get you back on to talk about other stuff in the future for sure.
That would be awesome.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers. Bye.